The door was already open when Seraphina reached it. She had not planned to go looking for anything that night. She had simply followed the silence, the particular kind that fills a space when the person who is supposed to be in it is not. Selim had missed dinner again. The fourth time that week. Seraphina had sat at the long dining table long enough that the candles burned 2 full inches before she finally covered the food and went looking for him. Not out of anger. She was not angry. She was something quieter and more unsettling than angry, the version of worry that arrives when you know, somewhere below conscious thought, that what you are afraid of has already happened and you have simply not confirmed it yet. She had been feeling that particular kind of worried for months. It had arrived the way the worst things always do, not as a single dramatic revelation but as an accumulation of small wrongnesses she kept finding reasonable explanations for. Selim was under pressure. The Eastern Territory disputes were demanding his full attention. The Pack Council was divided on 3 separate border questions and he was carrying the weight of resolution for all of them. She did not want to be the kind of Luna who added to his burdens by needing constant reassurance. She had told herself that. She had believed it, mostly. She had told Lyra, over tea on a slow autumn afternoon 3 months ago, that she sometimes felt Selim pulling away from her and did not know how to close the distance between them. Lyra had listened with the warm, attentive expression she had always had, the face that Seraphina had trusted and relied on for 22 years, the face of someone who was genuinely interested in whatever you were telling her and never made you feel foolish for saying it. Lyra had said, very gently, "Sarah, he adores you. You are feeling the anxiety of someone who loves too much and worries too deeply. You are doing everything right. Stop tormenting yourself." Seraphina had believed her. She had believed Lyra for 22 years, since the morning they met at 8 years old sitting on the stone wall outside the village school, Seraphina arriving to find Lyra already there, both of them new and both of them alone, Seraphina saying that looks like a good wall for sitting on, "Can I sit too?" and Lyra moving over without a word and the friendship beginning right there as simply and permanently as the ground they were sitting on. 22 years. For 22 years, Lyra had been the person Seraphina called when anything went wrong. The person who showed up. The person who stayed. Standing now in the corridor outside Lyra's private chamber, with her hand flat against the cold stone wall and the soft, familiar sound of laughter drifting under the closed door, Seraphina understood exactly what that laughter meant and exactly what it was going to cost her to understand it. The laughter was the kind that belongs only to people who have built something private and warm between them over time. It was not loud or dramatic. It was simply intimate in a register that excluded her completely, the unguarded, easy sound of 2 people who had become, over some number of months she had not been permitted to know about, each other's comfortable place. The sound of people who have stopped being careful around each other. She pushed the door open slowly. Not dramatically. She simply needed to see with her own eyes what her body had already been telling her for weeks and her mind had been carefully, persistently refusing to accept. Selim was on the window bench with Lyra, angled toward her in the way that people angle toward someone who has become the natural center of their attention. Lyra's hand was near his on the bench between them. They were not embracing. There was no single obvious image that told the complete story. What told it was the way Selim's posture had opened toward Lyra, fully relaxed, completely unguarded, so utterly different from the careful, slightly defended way he had been holding himself around Seraphina for months. What told it was the way Lyra's eyes had been on his face, soft and entirely at ease, before she registered the open door and went rigid with the shock of it. What told it was the way both of them went completely, utterly still, the way only people caught in the middle of something they cannot explain ever go still. Seraphina stood in the doorway and looked at them. She looked for long enough to be absolutely certain she was seeing what she was seeing and was not going to find a different explanation if she looked longer. Then she said, very quietly, "How long?" It was not a question with an open answer. The inflection was flat. Selim stood. The expression on his face was not the sharp, flinching guilt she might have expected. It was something more exhausted than that, the face of a man who has been postponing a very difficult conversation for a very long time and has finally, entirely, run out of space to keep postponing it. He had prepared for this moment, she could see that. He simply had not prepared for her to arrive at it first. Sarah. How long, Selim? Lyra stood too. Lyra, who had never in 22 years of their friendship backed down from a difficult moment or hidden behind someone else when something hard needed to be faced directly. She stood with her arms at her sides and met Seraphina's eyes with an expression that was complicated and painful and genuine and did not, Seraphina noticed with the particular clarity that arrives sometimes in the middle of terrible things, contain any indication that she intended to choose Seraphina over what she had built with Selim. 6 months, Lyra said. Selim closed his eyes briefly. Seraphina did not cry. She was not sure, in the immediate moment, why not. She had always been someone who cried easily, who had never believed that keeping emotions inside made them easier to carry. But what she felt standing in this doorway was not liquid. It was hard and still and very specific, the way something feels when it has been forming underground for a long time and has finally broken through the surface into solid, undeniable fact. 6 months. She counted backward without intending to. 6 months ago, she had told Selim across the small dinner table that she was happy. Had said it simply and plainly, the way she said most things, and he had covered her hand with his and said so am I, and she had believed him. 6 months ago, she had told Lyra over tea in the Luna's quarters that she felt lucky, genuinely and specifically lucky, and Lyra had smiled and refilled her cup without a word. She had been sitting across from the people who were quietly dismantling her life and she had felt grateful for what she had. I want to understand, Seraphina said. She genuinely meant it. Not as performance of dignity. She needed to know, specifically, honestly, if there was something she had missed in herself, some real failure between her and Selim that she had not been able to see, some crack in the foundation that she might have addressed if only she had known to look for it. Selim crossed the room. He stood in front of her and the tiredness in his eyes was deeper than it had ever been in the years she had looked at him across a pillow or across a table or across a crowded council chamber. Deeper than the tiredness of this week or this month. The tiredness of something longer than that. You didn't do anything wrong, he said carefully. You were everything you were supposed to be. Then why? He was quiet. The fire in Lyra's hearth was the only sound in the room. Then Selim said the thing that would live in Seraphina's chest for years, because Lyra doesn't need me to protect her. Seraphina looked at him without speaking. You are good, Sarah. You are warm and generous and the people here love you. But you need things. You need someone to be present. You need someone to see you. Lyra just exists alongside me. It doesn't feel like effort. Seraphina thought about 7 years. She thought about the War Council session in their 2nd year together, when she had not been included in the invitation because Selim's generals had assumed the Luna's role was ceremonial and decorative, and she had attended anyway and had identified a critical strategic error in the proposed military plan, an error that would have sent 300 soldiers into an ambush they would not have walked out of. She had identified it completely and walked the council through the evidence and they had changed the plan and those 300 soldiers had come home. No one had thanked her specifically. Selim had touched her arm afterward and said well done and moved on to the next item on his agenda. She thought about the winter of the supply failures, when the outer villages had been written off by the council as too remote to reach in the available time. And she had personally redesigned the entire distribution network using 3 alternative routes and had gotten food to every community before the worst of the cold set in. She thought about 43 official diplomatic dinners she had organized and managed from the first invitation to the last farewell, every detail of every one of them, while Selim led the formal proceedings at the head of the table. She thought about the open hours she held every week in the small side room of the East Wing so that any PAC member could come directly to her with a concern without navigating official channels or waiting for a formal council audience. She thought about the relationships she had built across the 5 territories, one real and careful and attentive conversation at a time. Relationships that Selim's council referred to as the Pack's diplomatic alliances without ever once noting who had actually built them or how. She thought about all of it, and she understood what Selim had just told her. He had watched her pour herself into their life together without complaint, without flagging, without demanding acknowledgement for the specific and extensive work she was doing every single day. And he had interpreted that steadiness as evidence that she was someone who required constant caretaking. He had looked at a woman who made everything function so smoothly that the functioning became invisible, and he had decided the invisible work was not work at all but rather a need she was placing on him. He had called her diligence dependence. He had called the effortlessness of her effort a burden. He had called the most competent person in every room he had ever shared with her someone who needed protecting. It was such a complete and specific form of being unseen that she did not have immediate words for it. She thought about all the days she had spent at meetings she had not been invited to until she insisted on being included. She thought about the letters she had written on Selim's behalf when he was occupied elsewhere, letters that had preserved 3 alliances that his council had been on the verge of losing through inattention. She thought about the pack members who had come to her over the years with problems they were afraid to bring to the Alpha, domestic difficulties, disputes with neighbors, children who needed resources the official channels had denied, and how she had quietly, carefully resolved every one of them, not because it was expected of her, not because she had been asked, but because she genuinely cared about the people of this territory and could not watch a solvable problem go unsolved when she was standing right there with the knowledge and the capacity to address it. She thought about the night 2 years ago when Selim had been sick, genuinely ill with the kind of fever that lays even very strong people completely flat, and she had managed 3 back-to-back council sessions in his place, handled a minor territorial dispute through formal correspondence without letting the other party know the Alpha was incapacitated, reorganized the week's schedule so that nothing urgent was missed and nothing was permanently delayed, and sat with him through the nights when the fever was highest and made sure he drank enough and slept enough and did not try to get up and go back to work before he was able to. She had not told anyone about any of it. It had not occurred to her to tell anyone. It was simply what you did for the person you loved and the community you were responsible for. Selim had recovered and said thank you and moved on. She had not expected more than that. She had not wanted more than that. She had simply been glad he was well and that nothing had been permanently disrupted. She stood in Lyra's doorway thinking about all of that and understanding, with a clarity that was almost physical in how specific it was, that she had made a significant and foundational error over the course of 7 years. She had believed that being invisible, that making her competence so seamless that it disappeared into the background of the life she was managing, was a form of generosity. She had believed that a love strong enough would not need to be seen in order to be valued. She had believed that the quality of the work would speak for itself even if no one was listening. None of that, it turned out, was how things actually worked. I see, she said. She turned and walked out of the room. She heard Lyra call her name behind her. Selim did not speak. She walked down the long stone corridor at a steady, unhurried pace, the pace of someone who knows exactly where she is going and is not in a hurry because there is no reason to hurry, because whatever is waiting will wait for her to arrive. Past the portraits of previous Lunas on the walls, women whose actual work had been absorbed into the general history without attribution and without names on their plaques, only their faces and their dates. Past the guards who nodded to her as she passed, every single one of them someone she had personally advocated to promote. Past the Great Hall. Past the small side room with the open hours sign still on the door. She went to her chambers. She sat on the edge of the bed. She placed both hands flat on her knees. She was pregnant. She had known for 11 days. She had been waiting for the right moment to tell Selim, had been imagining what his face would do when she said the words, had allowed herself the quiet, private warmth of picturing what it would mean for all 3 of them. She had not told a single person. Not Lyra. Not Helen, her attendant. Not the pack healer who had confirmed the result and sealed it under a privacy hold at Seraphina's specific request. She sat with that for a long time. The fire in the hearth burned down slowly. Outside, the sounds of the evening court continued from the lower floors, music and conversation and the ordinary, indifferent rhythm of a world that had no idea anything had just irrevocably changed. Seraphina was very good at thinking carefully in circumstances that did not permit falling apart. It was not something she said about herself, it was not the kind of quality that was easy or comfortable to claim, but she knew it privately, the way you know your own steadiest characteristic when you are alone with it. She had been forged in a northern village where falling apart was a luxury. The weather and the season and the reality of the place did not extend to anyone. She had always thought clearly in hard moments. She thought clearly now. She thought about Selim and what he would decide in the morning. She thought about pack law and what the elder statutes required for a Luna bond dissolution of any kind, and specifically what they required for a dissolution involving a bond of particular standing. She thought about the Elder Council and each of its current members, their individual values, their histories, their specific sense of what the law was for and who it was meant to protect. She thought about the 5 territories and every relationship she had built across them over 7 years, one real and honest conversation at a time. She thought about her child, who was not yet real to anyone else in the world but was entirely, specifically, completely real to her. She made several decisions in that room. She made them carefully and precisely and without permitting herself to revisit any of them once they were made. By morning, Selim had already spoken to his inner council. The news reached Seraphina through Helen, who came before the morning meal with trembling hands and wide, frightened eyes and the specific, miserable expression of someone who has been given a terrible errand and cannot find any way to not complete it. Helen said it anyway because there was no one else to say it and because Seraphina had always treated her with genuine care and dignity, and Helen could not repay that with silence. The Alpha King intended to dissolve the Luna bond. He was naming Lyra Ashvale as the new Luna. The formal announcement would be made at the mid-morning court session, before the full assembled council and all diplomatic representatives currently in residence at the palace. Seraphina listened to every word. Then she said, "Thank you, Helen. Please go and eat something. You have done absolutely nothing wrong." Helen left. Seraphina stood at her window and looked at the mountains that ringed the Draven territory. She had always loved those mountains. She had learned every one of their individual names in her first month at the palace, had walked their lower trails in every season, had stood at the highest accessible peak twice, once in summer and once in late autumn, and felt, both times, that something very old and very patient was looking back at her across the distance between them. She was not going to stand in that court session and be present for Selim's version of events. She was not going to give him the image of her standing in the background of his announcement, still, composed, absorbing it, confirming by her very presence that she had no alternative and nowhere else to go. She was not going to make it easier for him to frame what he had done as a decision rather than a failure. She packed one bag, carefully and without waste or sentiment. She left her official Luna seal in the exact center of her desk where it would be found immediately. She wrote one letter, not to Selim, not to Lyra, but formatted in the precise legal language of the Elder Council, containing 3 specific items she had been quietly gathering and documenting for 8 months, since a conversation with an elder archivist had entirely reframed her understanding of her own history and what it meant. She took the letter to George in the palace kitchen. George had worked in that building for 31 years and had the particular, unshowy dignity of someone who has done their job well every single day for 3 decades without requiring anyone to notice. He had also, on many evenings over 7 years, left warm food outside Seraphina's study door on the nights when she was working past every reasonable hour. Never with a note. Just the food, covered, still hot. She had never asked him to. He had simply done it because he had noticed she needed it and because noticing and responding to what people need was, apparently, simply how he was built. "Give this directly to Council Dorian," she said. "Not to the king's secretary." To Dorian himself, or to whoever holds senior elder standing today if Dorian is not available. Can you do that for me? George looked at the letter in her hand. He looked at her face. He had the kind of eyes that come from having watched enough of life for nothing to require much explanation. Yes, he said. Just that. She touched his arm briefly. She walked out of the kitchen exit. The morning air hit her face cold and clean. The mountains ahead of her were gold and pale pink in the early light. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder, set her face north, and began walking. Nobody stopped her. Nobody even saw her leave. The mid-morning court session was the most uncomfortable gathering the Draven Palace had hosted in a generation. Not because of what Selim said, though what he said was significant enough that 3 senior elder representatives set down their cups in the same moment, but because of what was missing. There was no Luna at the Alpha King's side. Selim had not seriously considered this possibility. He had assumed Seraphina would be present because he had assumed, without examining the assumption, that being reasonable and dignified in terrible situations was simply what Seraphina did, that she would absorb this one too, that she would stand in that court and be still for it the way she had always been still for difficult things. He had built his entire plan around her presence. He delivered the announcement. The dissolution. The naming of Lyra. The legal mechanisms that would follow. His voice stayed controlled and his posture remained steady. But the room was not with him, and he could feel it the way you feel a strong current pulling beneath still water, the surface calm but something large moving underneath in a direction he had not planned for. Counsel Dorian raised his hand during the formal question period. Dorian was 79 years old and had the particular, unhurried precision of someone who had been reading power and political situations for so long that he had stopped needing to use any effort to do it. "Where is the Luna?" he asked. Pleasantly. Carefully. "She is aware of the proceedings." "Alpha Draven," Dorian said, in that same pleasant, careful tone, "I did not ask whether she is aware of the proceedings. I asked where she is." The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone. By early afternoon, the letter Seraphina had given to George had reached Counsel Dorian's private chamber. Dorian read it twice, slowly and completely, and then called a closed emergency session of the full Elder Council, the binding legal kind, independent of any pack authority structure, carrying the full weight of elder law. The letter contained 3 things: a certified record of the Luna bond, formally witnessed and dated. A documented account of the Vale bloodline with supporting archive records that Dorian recognized immediately as the kind of material that existed below the awareness of most people because most people had never had occasion to look for it. And a single sentence written at the very end, in Seraphina's clean, unhurried handwriting: "I am not leaving because I am defeated. I am leaving because I choose the terms of what comes next." Dorian set the letter down on the table. He looked at his colleagues around it. "This," he said quietly, "is going to become a very significant problem for the Alpha King." Not one person sitting at that table disagreed with him. On the North Road, Seraphina was already 3 hours ahead of anyone who might have thought to follow. She walked steadily and she did not look back, because there was nothing behind her she needed to see. Everything she needed was somewhere ahead of her, in the blank space at the top of the official maps, where the forgotten people had been living without anyone paying attention for a very long time. She was going to pay attention. She was going to find them. She was going to build something real with them that nobody in any territory would ever be able to take apart. She had been preparing for this her entire life. She had simply not known what she was preparing for until now. She had been walking for 3 days when the cold became truly serious. The Ashen Wilds had not been named for anything gentle. The name came from the color of the winter sky above it, a pale, exhausted gray that settled over the landscape from horizon to horizon and pressed everything beneath it flat and colorless, as if the light itself had given up. The trees were dark and narrow, growing in tight clusters that blocked the wind without admitting any warmth. The ground was frozen solid in dense layers. The wind came in sideways without warning and found every gap in every layer of clothing with what felt like specific, deliberate intent. Seraphina had packed sensibly. She had grown up in a northern village and she understood cold weather at the level of the body rather than the level of theory, how to layer correctly for sustained movement rather than standing still, how to protect the core temperature during rest periods, when stopping was smarter than pushing and when pushing was necessary because stopping would cost more than it saved, how to read the quality of light that meant a temperature drop was coming before the temperature actually dropped. She knew all of this the way you know things taught in childhood out of pure necessity rather than any academic interest, deeply and without having to think consciously about them. But knowing these things and having a body that had spent 7 years in the warm, well-supplied comfort of a palace were two different problems, and her body had not forgotten comfort even when her mind was entirely committed to something harder than comfort. She built a fire each night at the edge of wherever she stopped, choosing her stopping points with care for wind protection and proximity to water. She ate exactly what she had allocated for each day, not less, because she was eating for more than herself now and she knew it, and not more, because she had no way of knowing how long this part of the journey would take. She slept precisely as long as her body required and no longer, setting herself to wake with the first light. She did not allow herself to think too far ahead, which was unusual for her. She was by nature and by long practice someone who planned in long arcs, who thought 6 steps ahead as a matter of course, who found the big picture easier than the immediate moment. But thinking in long arcs in those first days would have made the distance feel impossible rather than manageable. She broke the journey into individual hours and dealt with each one as it arrived. She thought about her child constantly. Not with fear, with something that was the opposite of fear. The child was the most settled and certain thing she had in those cold and difficult hours, a fixed point when everything else was in motion and uncertain. She talked to the child in her mind in the private interior language she was developing for this specific relationship, the way all parents begin long before there is anyone who can hear them. "I am taking us somewhere safe," she said silently, moving steadily north. "I have not found it yet, but I will. I always find what I am actually looking for, when I know clearly what I am looking for." And she was beginning to understand, as she walked and thought and let the miles settle something in her, what she was actually looking for. Not just a safe place. Not just an alternative to what she had left. She was looking for the complete version of herself, the version that included everything she had always been but had been shaping into the specific and narrowing form of what Luna required. The parts of her that were not warm or diplomatic or accommodating. The parts that were precise and capable of genuine anger and unwilling to bend when bending was wrong. The parts she had been setting aside for 7 years because there had never seemed to be an appropriate place for them. She was walking toward all of that. She intended to arrive. She thought about what she had been. Not in a mournful or self-pitying way, she had no patience for either of those modes when they became obstacles rather than honest processing. She thought about it the way she would have thought about an analysis of any other situation she was trying to understand clearly. She had been a Luna who believed, genuinely and without any conscious strategy behind it, that goodness was its own protection. She had believed that if she loved well and worked hard and treated people with honesty and care, the universe would maintain a basic reciprocity. That the good she put into the world would hold her in return. That had turned out to be incorrect. Not because goodness had no value, she still believed it had enormous value. She intended to spend the rest of her life applying it. She would not have traded the quality of the person she had become for any other life she could imagine. But because goodness, alone and without structure and without the willingness to claim space and hold it, was not sufficient protection against people who decided it was convenient to set you aside. She had been good without being strategic. She had been loyal without being careful about where she placed that loyalty. She had been generous without ever asking what was being built for her in return. She was going to be all of those things again, the goodness, the loyalty, the generosity, but she was going to be them differently. She was going to be them with her eyes open and her hands on the controls and the full weight of everything she knew deployed in service of what she was building rather than what she was supporting. She was going to stop making her competence invisible and start making it completely, undeniably visible. She was going to stop performing effortlessness and start demanding credit for the effort. Not for pride. For accuracy. Because the world ran on accurate assessments of where value came from, and she had been allowing the world to be inaccurate about her for 7 years, and the consequences of that inaccuracy had finally arrived. The cold helped, in a way she had not expected. It demanded her full attention. It did not permit distraction or philosophical wandering. Each day in the Ashen Wilds required the complete and practical application of everything she knew, and there was something clarifying about that. About being in an environment where the question was not how to be gracious in a complicated political situation, but rather how to stay warm and functional and moving forward in difficult conditions. She was good at complicated political situations. She was also, it turned out, good at this. She had simply not been in circumstances that required her to know that about herself. On the 4th day of the journey, a large man stepped out of a stand of bare winter trees onto the road directly in front of her. She had been tracking him for 2 minutes before he moved. She had the specific skill of noticing when something in her environment was subtly wrong, developed over years of managing rooms full of competing interests and hidden agendas, of reading what people in complicated situations were not saying as clearly as what they were. A man standing completely still behind trees in bitter cold, doing nothing visible for no apparent reason, is always subtly wrong. She had registered him, filed him, and prepared a response before he took his first step onto the road. He was large and carried himself with the posture of someone who had used his physical size successfully as an argument many times before and had every expectation of using it successfully again. "Northern Road is closed to travelers," he said. "There is a toll to pass." Seraphina stopped walking and looked at him steadily. She was not afraid, not exactly. She was alert in the full, precise way she was alert now in everything, every sense engaged. "Is it a pack toll or a personal one?" she asked. He blinked. The question had clearly not been anticipated. "What?" "A formal pack toll requires an official seal, a posted notice, and a rate that applies equally to all travelers." "Are you representing an official pack authority, or is this something you have decided to do independently today?" He looked at her. She was small and traveling alone and carrying one bag. The calculation moving through his eyes was not complicated. "Because if this is personal," she continued, in exactly the same calm and conversational tone she had been using, "you should be aware that I have spent 7 years studying pack law across all 5 territories, including the specific statutes that govern unauthorized tolling on public roads in neutral territory. I know those provisions completely. I can cite every relevant one from memory right now, if that would be helpful." The man was quiet for a long moment. "I am genuinely happy to do that," she said. He stepped to the side of the road. Seraphina walked past him without hurrying and without looking back. She thought about that moment later, not with satisfaction exactly, but with something like recognition of herself. She had spent 7 years being soft. Genuinely soft, not as calculation or strategy, she had been that way because she genuinely was, because her environment rewarded those qualities and she had felt them truly and had not needed to perform them. But softness had never been everything she was. It had been the outermost surface of something much older and far less easily moved. She was beginning to find the rest of it again, the way you find something in a room you have not entered for a long time, surprised it is still exactly where you left it, and then not surprised at all. By the end of the first week she had reached the deeper part of the Ashen Wilds, the territory that appeared on official pack maps as blank space, labeled simply as unaffiliated. This was where the forgotten people lived. Wolves whose packs had dissolved in territorial disputes and who had been given no assistance in finding a new structure. Mates who had been abandoned after bonds were broken unilaterally by alphas who decided the bond was no longer convenient. Older wolves whose alphas had decided they were consuming more resources than they contributed and had quietly stopped including them in pack protections. Young wolves who had run from circumstances that would have consumed them if they had stayed long enough for it to happen. Seraphina had known they were here. She had read about them in the population assessment documents that Selim's council had filed and never looked at again because they had decided the neutral territory population was strategically irrelevant. She had read those documents carefully, she read everything carefully, it was simply how she was built, and she had understood, reading them, that there were hundreds of real people in the blank spaces on the official maps, people who had been placed there by decisions made by powerful people who had never been required to live with the consequences. The first person she met who was not immediately looking for something from her was Eleanor. Eleanor was 71 years old and had been living alone in a small stone structure she had built herself at the edge of a frozen creek for 15 years, since the territorial merger that had dissolved her pack had left her with essentially nothing. She had been a pack healer, a good one, with 40 years of experience and meticulous records, and she had walked into the Ashen Wilds with her medical kit and her knowledge and had slowly and steadily built a quiet, functional life from whatever the land and the occasional passing stranger could provide. She maintained a healer's practice for the scattered population of the surrounding area, keeping detailed records the way she had always kept records, because she had always believed that careful documentation was the most important service a healer could provide to the people who came after her. She looked at Seraphina for a long, assessing moment when she appeared at the door, taking in the single bag, the early pregnancy that was beginning to show, the particular quality in her eyes that was exhaustion without defeat, alertness without agitation. Then she said, simply, "You have been walking for more than a week. Come inside." Seraphina went inside. Eleanor gave her food and warm fire and asked no questions for a full hour. Then, when the worst of the tension had left Seraphina's shoulders and the color had returned fully to her face, she said, "What are you planning to build?" Seraphina looked at the fire for a moment. She had not said it out loud yet. It had been assembling itself in the quiet hours of walking, forming in the space behind her thoughts where conclusions arrive before you are fully ready to articulate them. "Something that cannot be taken from me," she said. "Something built with people who are there because they chose to be. Not because of who I was connected to. Because of who I actually am and what I am actually capable of." "I have been waiting for someone like you for approximately 12 years, Eleanor said. She talked for nearly 2 hours. She told Seraphina about the surrounding population, names, specific histories, particular skills, individual needs, the exact nature of the problems that had been left unresolved for years because there was no one with the standing or the will to address them. She spoke with the detailed and practical knowledge of someone who had been quietly keeping track of these people because nobody else was, and who had understood for a long time that what they needed was structure and someone capable of providing it, and who had been waiting for that person to arrive. Seraphina listened without interrupting once. She asked precise questions where she needed to. She remembered every name and every detail the first time she heard it. By the time the fire burned low, she had a clear and specific plan, not a vague emotional intention but the structural, practical plan of someone who had spent 7 years learning exactly what communities needed in order to function. What made people feel safe enough to invest their loyalty in something. What the actual requirements of governing any group of people were. How disputes needed to be handled and why transparency in that process mattered so much. What happened to trust when it was maintained consistently and what happened to it when it was violated even once. She had every piece of this knowledge. She had developed all of it in service of someone else's kingdom. She had poured it into making a place function beautifully and had never once thought about using it for anything else, because she had believed in what she was doing and in the person she was doing it for. Both of those things were over now. And everything she knew was still hers. She asked Eleanor, on the second night, what had sustained her through 15 years of this. Not the practical things, she understood those. The medical knowledge, the records, the quiet work of keeping herself useful. She meant the other thing. The thing that made someone keep getting up in the morning when they were doing it alone and had been for a long time and when the original community that had given their existence structure had been dissolved without their consent. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fire. Then she said, because I was always going to be this person. The pack was where I practiced being this person. When the pack was gone, I was still this person. I had to find somewhere to put it. Seraphina looked at her. That is exactly it, she said. That is exactly the thing. You already know that, Eleanor said. You have known it since before you walked through my door. I saw it in your face the moment you arrived. You are not someone who is lost. You are someone who has been displaced. Seraphina thought about the distinction between those two things for a long time afterward. Lost was a state of not knowing who you were or what you were for. Displaced was a state of knowing exactly who you were and what you were for and simply not yet being in the right place to put it. She had been displaced for months, perhaps for longer than she had realized, now that she was honest about it. And displacement was something you could fix. You moved yourself. You found the right place and you put yourself in it and you began. She was going to begin. The community that grew up around her in those first weeks was not impressive in the way that impressive things usually look. There was no dramatic founding moment, no speech that changed everything, no single event that she could point to later and say that was when it started. It started the way real things always start, slowly, quietly, through the accumulation of small right decisions made consistently over time. Someone saw something done well and told someone else. Someone felt, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that a decision affecting their life had been made with genuine care for their specific situation rather than as an application of general principle from a distance. Someone was heard, clearly and completely, by a person with the ability to respond, and something was done about what they had said. That was how it grew. One person at a time. One real interaction at a time. One problem genuinely solved at a time. She introduced herself to the 43 people Eleanor had described over the following 3 days, meeting each of them individually before meeting them together as a group. This was not a strategy she had deliberately designed, it was simply how she naturally worked. She needed to understand each person specifically before she could understand how they related to each other. She listened more than she spoke. She asked practical questions about what currently existed, what problems had been sitting unresolved for lack of someone with the standing to address them, what disputes had been creating ongoing tension in the community. The disputes were where she started. There were 3, a boundary question between 2 families that had been creating conflict for over a year, a food storage access disagreement that had produced a genuine and lasting rift between 2 groups of people, and a situation involving an elderly wolf whose pack connection had been severed and who had no formal standing anywhere and no clear claim to any protections. She addressed all 3 within the first week, handling each one openly, walking through her reasoning at every step, explaining not just what she had decided but why, inviting challenge to her logic at each stage. Every resolution held. Not because she had compelled anything, but because she had been genuinely right, and she had shown her work, and people recognize correctness when it is presented to them honestly and without condescension. Within a month there were more than 100 people. Word moved through the Ashen Wilds the way information moves among people who have nothing to protect and therefore no incentive to misrepresent things, directly and without agenda. Someone who had been helped told someone else who needed help. Someone who had watched Seraphina handle a difficult situation in a way they had genuinely never seen it handled told 3 more people. Someone who had been at the meeting where the boundary dispute was resolved came to Seraphina afterward and told her about a situation 2 hours away that had been causing harm for years and that she might be able to address. She addressed it. The 43 became 100. The 100 became 200. The 200 began approaching 300. She built structure as the numbers grew, not imposing it from above but developing it through open discussion with the people it would govern, making sure that every mechanism she created was understood by the people living inside it, that every rule was explained and every decision was made transparent. A community council with rotating membership so that no permanent group could calcify into a self-serving authority. A resource-sharing system with clear and public rules that applied equally to everyone without exception. A formal process for dispute resolution that any member could access without needing connections or status to navigate it. A medical program under Eleanor's direction that extended care to every person in the community regardless of what they had or had not contributed recently, because Eleanor had strong opinions about conditional healthcare and Seraphina agreed with every one of them. She trained every morning before the camp woke up. She trained with the former fighters in her community who agreed to teach her what they knew, and she was honest with them about exactly what she did not know, which made the teaching easier and the improvement faster. Within 6 months she was skilled enough that no one questioned her right to stand at the front of anything. Not because she was the most physically powerful person in the community, she was not, and she had never tried to be, but because she was the most precisely prepared and the most tactically clear-headed, and those qualities outweigh raw strength in every situation that actually matters. She gave birth to Aiden in late winter. Eleanor and a young healer named Clara attended. It was long and it was hard in the particular way that first births are hard, and when it was over and Eleanor placed him in Seraphina's arms and he opened his dark eyes and found her face, she felt something enormous and specific and completely without an adequate name for it. She held him and thought, very clearly and simply, I did not know this was where I was going all along. But it was. It absolutely was. 3 days after Aiden was born, the first wolves arrived from outside the Ashen Wilds to ask if they could join the pack she was forming. Word had traveled, she did not know exactly how, but it always did, that the Luna of the Draven pack had come to the neutral territory and was building something real, something that was not built on power or fear or obligation. They had heard she was the kind of leader who remembered your name and meant it. She asked every one of their names before she asked anything else. She remembered all of them immediately, the way she always remembered names, because names were how you showed someone they were real to you. By the time Aiden was walking with great confidence and strong opinions about everything in his environment, the Ashen Pack had more than 400 members. A functioning governance structure. 3 established trading agreements with neutral territory merchants who had come to trust them because the Ashen Pack always honored its commitments exactly as stated. A medical center under Eleanor's direction that had treated nearly every wolf in the community at least once. A formal application pending before the Elder Council for official pack recognition. It was the fastest growing community in the neutral territories in a generation. And every single person in it had chosen to be there. Not inherited the membership. Not been assigned. Not stayed because leaving would cost them something they could not afford. Chosen, with full and clear-eyed knowledge of the alternatives. Seraphina understood that this was the difference between what she was building and what she had left. And it was not a small difference. It was the entire thing. The message from Council Dorian arrived on a morning in early spring when the light was just beginning to come back into the world after the long gray months of winter. It was delivered through the Elder Council's private courier network, a system old enough that it predated all 5 of the current Alpha bloodlines and operated with complete independence from any pack's official communication infrastructure, which was precisely why Dorian had used it. Dorian had been on the Elder Council for 31 of his 79 years. He had watched empires grow and fracture on the decisions of individual people and had developed, in those decades of sustained attention to large things developing from their earliest small moments, the particular instinct for historical significance that comes from having witnessed enough of it to recognize its shape before it is fully visible. His message was brief and precise in the way that Dorian was always brief and precise. Eastern Alliance incursions continuing into Draven territory, 2 formal violations recorded this season. King's Council divided on response strategy. Lyra Ashvale has not restored the diplomatic relationships you built during your tenure as Luna. Outer Territories report feeling unrepresented. I believe the moment you have been building toward is arriving ahead of the timeline either of us would have anticipated. Seraphina read it twice. She had not told Dorian she was building toward any specific moment. She had not needed to. He had understood it from the documentation she had been sending over the previous 2 years, the bloodline records, the legal filings, the careful procedural groundwork she had been laying with the patience of someone who understood that timing was not just important but was the single most consequential element of any action intended to have permanent consequences. He had read the shape of everything she was building and understood its destination without being told, the way that very experienced people sometimes understand things that have not been said because they have learned to read what is not said as clearly as what is. She wrote back in the same careful, precise language, 3 more months to complete the final documentation. Then I will submit the formal summit request through proper channels. Dorian replied within 2 days, which was fast for the Elder Council. I will ensure the right attendance. She set the letters carefully in her files and looked across her study at Iden, who was 2 years old and deeply committed to the project of stacking small stones on the ledge of the windowsill. He placed each stone with serious deliberation, assessing its position before committing to it. He built the tower to 4 stones. The 5th made the whole thing fall. He studied the fallen stones with an expression of focused, private thought. Then he began again from the beginning, without any visible frustration or impatience, as if the collapse had simply given him useful information about how to proceed differently. Seraphina watched him for a moment and felt something she could not name precisely, a specific and grounded satisfaction, quieter than happiness and more permanent than relief. She had built all of this. The study she was sitting in, the community outside its walls, the legal case taking shape in her files, the network of relationships stretching across the neutral territories and beyond. She had built every part of it from a single bag and a single letter and the knowledge she had spent 7 years acquiring in service of someone who had decided she was too much effort to keep. And this particular small person on the floor of it, stacking and restacking his stones with complete and serious commitment, was the best and most real thing she had ever made. 3 months. She returned to her work. The 3 months were the most technically demanding period of everything she had done since arriving in the Ashen Wilds. The emotional weight of what she was undertaking had been largely processed. She had given herself honest and full permission to process it, in the early months alone at night by the fire when there was time, and she had not avoided any part of it. She had let herself feel everything she needed to feel. She had grieved what she had lost, been angry about how it had been lost, been afraid about what she was doing in response to losing it. She had sat with all of it until she understood it clearly and no longer needed to keep circling it to make sure she understood it. What remained was precise and exacting in a different way. She needed to construct a legal case so completely documented and so meticulously argued that it would hold against the best legal representation the Draven Pack's considerable resources could assemble. She worked with Harold, the elder archivist who had first shown her the Vale bloodline documents nearly 3 years before. Harold was 63 and had the methodical, careful quality of someone who had spent his entire professional life cataloging things that other people considered too granular to bother with and had come to understand, through decades of that work, that the granular details were exactly where the truth lived and where the significant questions were answered. Together they traced every relevant legal precedent in elder law back as far as the records extended. They identified the exact statutory language applicable to sovereign Luna standing, not just what each provision said but what it had been intended to say and how it had been interpreted and applied in each of the 4 historical cases in which it had been invoked, and what those applications meant for the current situation. They documented every procedural failure in the dissolution of Seraphina's bond in the specific legal language that the Elder Council would recognize as properly formed and correctly applied. They assembled the case with the completeness and care of people who understood that they would have exactly one opportunity to present it. Seraphina also spent time, during those 3 months, in quiet and private conversations with leaders of 3 specific packs, not large enough to challenge Selim militarily, but communities that held genuine standing in the Elder Council's estimation and with which Seraphina had built real personal relationships during her years as Luna. Relationships built on actual care and actual attention rather than political calculation. She did not call in favors. She had honest conversations about what the summit would mean for the larger and more important question of whether elder law was genuinely binding on Alpha Kings or effectively advisory in practice. Every one of those leaders confirmed that the question mattered significantly to them and that they would attend the summit as engaged and committed participants. By the end of the 3 months, she had assembled the most comprehensively documented and carefully constructed legal case the Elder Council had received in 40 years. She submitted the formal summit request through the correct official channels. Dorian confirmed receipt within a day and convened the 5-territory summit for 3 weeks' time, using his authority as senior elder representative to ensure appropriate attendance from every significant party. Aiden was informed that they were going on a long journey. He asked if he could bring his rocks. Seraphina said 4 rocks. Eleanor, who had announced that she would be accompanying the delegation regardless of whether she had been formally included in it, agreed that 4 rocks was a perfectly reasonable number. Aiden accepted this outcome without protest, which was unusually flexible of him for someone with strong opinions about rocks. The delegation traveled south over 3 days along roads that grew more traveled and more familiar as they moved deeper into Draven territory. Seraphina spent the travel time reviewing her documentation one final time, not because she doubted any of it, but because thoroughness was how she approached everything that mattered, and she was not going to stop now. Owen, the former pack lawyer who had joined the Ashen Pack 14 months ago after his previous alpha had terminated his position without cause or process, contributed 2 clarifications to the argument during the journey that sharpened 2 of the central points in ways that improved them meaningfully. Mara, who managed the Ashen Pack's external relations with a diplomatic precision that Seraphina admired enormously, had prepared thorough briefings for each of the 3 allied pack leaders attending the summit and had ensured that all communication logistics were properly in place. By the time they reached the Draven Palace gates, Seraphina was as prepared as it was possible for any person to be for something that had never been done before in the recorded history of the 5 territories. The gates opened. Selim was standing at the top of the main steps. She had thought about this moment many times over the 2.5 years since she had left. She had prepared for it deliberately and honestly, not by telling herself it would be easy or that she was entirely past everything, but by acknowledging clearly what it would be and deciding, in advance, exactly how she intended to meet it. She was realistic enough about herself to know that certain things do not fully resolve no matter how much honest work you put into processing them. 7 years was a long time. It had been real, most of it, for most of those years. That did not become nothing. But she was also, after 2.5 years of building something genuinely real in genuinely difficult circumstances, so different from the woman who had walked out of this palace through the kitchen exit on a cold morning that the comparison felt almost startling. She stood differently. She moved through space differently. She was accompanied by wolves who deferred to her in the constant, unconscious way that only genuine and freely chosen loyalty produces, not protocol, not duty, not fear of consequences. The actual thing, freely given. She stepped out of the delegation and looked up at him. He had changed in the ways that people change when they have been managing something harder than they anticipated and have not admitted that difficulty to anyone, including themselves. There were lines around his eyes. A tightness in his jaw that she recognized as the strain of sustained effort wearing itself into the face. He looked at her and she watched him take a moment to recalibrate, to reconcile the person standing before him with the person he had last seen 3 years ago in this same courtyard. She had changed too. Not in any single obvious way. In the deep structural way that people change when something difficult has passed entirely through them and they have come out the other side of it more fully themselves than they were when it began. Seraphina, he said. Alpha Draven, she replied. Pleasant. Level. Correct. She walked up the steps without waiting for anyone to guide her. The Great Hall had been arranged in full formal session order. 200 chairs held representatives from every major pack in the 5 territories, the complete Elder Council in ceremonial standing, diplomatic observers from 3 neighboring allied regions, and the legal representatives of every party to the proceedings. The room held the specific contained tension of people who understood, without needing to be told, that they were present for something that would be studied and referenced and debated for a very long time. Lyra was present, seated in the Draven section with the formal composure of someone who had been preparing for this moment and was determined to maintain their footing in it. Seraphina noted her location when she entered the room and did not make it a moment. There would be a moment, but everything had its time, and this was not yet the time for that. Seraphina took her place at the center delegation table. Owen to her left, Mara to her right, Eleanor seated in the row directly behind. She arranged her documentation in the precise order she would present it, squared the edges of the stack, and felt, sitting in this room where she had hosted 43 official diplomatic dinners over 7 years, in this building she had poured herself into making function at its best, a specific and private feeling that she chose not to examine too closely, because this was not the moment for it. This was the moment for precision. Dorian opened the session with the Elder Council's formal protocol language, delivered in the even, authoritative voice of someone who had been doing this for 31 years and still meant every word of it. Then he invited Seraphina to present her case. She presented for nearly 50 minutes. She covered the bloodline documentation and its legal significance without assuming any prior knowledge in the room. She explained the relevant statutory framework completely and clearly, with specific reference to each applicable elder provision and its historical context and the 4 previous cases in which it had been invoked and what those invocations had established. She covered every procedural failure in the dissolution of her bond, naming each specific requirement that had not been met and the precise legal consequence of each failure under elder statute. She presented the formal standing of the Ashen Pack, with documentation of its governance structure, its population, and its compliance with all applicable elder requirements for official recognition. She walked through every element of her case in the order she had designed, clearly and without theater and without any appeal to emotion. She did not perform pain. She did not ask for sympathy. She made arguments, supported them with documented evidence, and trusted both to do what they were designed to do. Philip, Selim's legal representative, was a skilled lawyer who had clearly invested significant preparation time. He argued from the historical precedent of alpha authority in bond matters and from the legal distinction between nominal bloodline standing and active recognized pack authority. It was a genuinely strong argument built on real legal ground, organized carefully, and presented with genuine professional confidence. He was good at his work, and Seraphina gave him full credit for that even as she prepared to dismantle what he had built. She had anticipated every element of his argument. She had researched every precedent he cited and had identified the subsequent rulings that modified or qualified each of them in ways that were directly relevant to the current situation. When she stood to respond, she addressed each argument in the exact order it had been made, explaining each modification to each precedent with the patience and precision of someone who had spent weeks constructing this specific response, and showing not just that the modifications existed but what they had been intended to accomplish and why the Elder Council at each historical moment had seen the need for them. The reasoning, she had always believed, was where arguments found their genuine strength. Anyone could cite a ruling. Understanding why it had been made was something else entirely. When she finished, the room was entirely and completely quiet. Dorian called a recess for the Elder Council to deliberate privately. It lasted 93 minutes, which was not long for a decision of this magnitude. During the recess, Selim crossed the room toward her. She saw him coming across the cleared floor and waited without moving in any direction. He stood in front of her. He was quiet for a moment. She waited and did not fill the silence for him. "I used to watch you in council sessions," he said. His voice was quieter than it had been during the formal proceedings, and something in it was different from anything she recognized from the years of their bond. "You were always the most prepared person in any room you were in. I never examined what I thought about it carefully enough." "No," she said. "I was wrong about what I said that night. I knew it within 2 weeks of you leaving. I did not know how to say it or who would receive it if I tried." "I have a son," Seraphina said. "He is 2 years old. He has your eyes and he is extraordinary and he has never once heard your name. What happens in this room today will determine whether that changes." Something shifted in Selim's expression. "I am not here to ruin you," she said clearly. "I want you to understand that with complete certainty. I am here because what was done was wrong, not only to me but as a matter of law and as a matter of what these territories are supposed to stand for. Every person in these 5 regions, including the ones your council has never looked at, deserves to know that the law means what it says. That it applies to everyone without exception. That it is not decorative." A pause. "I believe you know I am right," she said. "I think you have known it for some time." The elder council returned before he could answer. Dorian stood at the head of the council table. Every person in the room was still. He read the ruling in full, in the clear and measured voice of someone who understood the weight of every word he was delivering. It was the most detailed binding decision the elder council had issued in 4 decades, and he gave every part of it the time it deserved. The core findings: the dissolution of Seraphina's Luna bond had been conducted in procedural violation of elder statute, specifically through the failure to consult the council regarding a bond carrying sovereign bloodline implications, a required consultation that had been omitted entirely. The Vale bloodline conferred sovereign Luna standing, a legally distinct category from standard Luna status, carrying specific protections and rights that were not subject to override by Alpha King authority. The installation of Lyra Ashvale as Luna was therefore legally invalid from the date of its announcement. The Ashen Pack held full and official standing under 5 territory law, effective immediately upon the Council's recognition. And Sovereign Luna authority was formally recognized as Council equivalent in matters of contested succession and territorial boundary disputes, in accordance with the ancient compact between the Elder Council and the founding Pack bloodlines, a compact older than any of the Alpha bloodlines currently ruling any territory. The hall held its breath. The Elder Council calls upon Alpha King Selim Draven to formally recognize the Sovereign Luna's authority and the standing of the Ashen Pack, Dorian said. The silence was absolute. Seraphina looked at the Elder Council table. She kept her expression level and she waited. She heard Selim before she saw him, the specific sound of someone making a physical decision, the shift of weight and posture that happens when the mind commits to something the body must now carry out. She turned. Selim Draven was on one knee on the stone floor of his own great hall. He did not look broken. He did not look like a man being forced into something against his will. He looked like a man who had arrived, finally, at the one genuinely honest thing he had been avoiding for 2.5 years, and who was doing it now without flinching because avoidance had become impossible and he had decided, somewhere in the minutes of watching the Elder Council file back into the room, that he was going to do this thing with whatever dignity he could bring to it. "I recognize Sovereign Luna Seraphina and the standing of the Ashen Pack," he said. Clearly. Steadily. Without qualification. Lyra stood from her seat and walked out through the side door without looking at anyone. Seraphina watched her go. She had prepared herself for many versions of this moment over the past 2.5 years, including versions where she felt much more than she actually felt. What she felt was not triumph and not grief and not the complicated mixture of both she had anticipated. It was something quieter and more settled and more permanent than either of those. It was the feeling of something being returned to its correct position after a long time in the wrong one. The feeling of accuracy. Dorian met her eyes across the room and gave her the smallest, most precise possible nod. She returned it. Then she stood and looked at the assembled room, every face, every witness, every representative from every territory who would carry this day back to every community that had sent them. "I want to say something outside the formal proceedings," she said. Not a person in the room moved. "What happened to me was wrong. But I did not travel here only on my own behalf. I came because there are people in every neutral territory and every borderland in these 5 regions who were discarded by people who had the power to discard them, wolves who held communities together for years and were told, when they became inconvenient, that their work had not mattered. Mates who were replaced without process or recourse. Older wolves pushed out because the cost of keeping them was deemed too high. Young ones who ran because their situations would have destroyed them if they stayed. She paused. This ruling is not about one Luna and one Alpha King. It is about whether the people who do the invisible work, who maintain the relationships, fill the gaps, remember the names, keep the communities functioning while the official record is being written about someone else, are protected by the same law that protects everyone else. After today, the answer is yes. Without condition. Without exception. And I intend to hold it to that standard. She gathered her documentation with the same careful efficiency she had arranged it. She thanked every member of the Elder Council by name, individually, and she meant each one. Then she walked out of the great hall through the main doors into the pale, clear light of the afternoon courtyard. She stood in it and she breathed. Once, deeply, and let something go that she had been carrying since the night she had stood in a doorway and understood for certain what she was looking at. Aiden was brought to her within the hour. He came at full speed with no interest in decorum, reaching for her immediately, and she took him and held him, and he smelled of outdoor air and something sweet that Eleanor had given him while he waited and had strong opinions about being made to wait. There was a knock at the guest chamber door 40 minutes later. Selim. She opened the door. He stood in the corridor with the particular expression of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and lost every word of it the moment the door actually opened and the situation became real. Aiden was on her hip. He turned his head and looked at Selim with the complete and uncomplicated curiosity of a 2-year-old who had not yet developed any instinct for caution about new people and was simply interested in everything that came into his field of vision. Selim looked at Aiden. His face did something private and complicated and deeply human that Seraphina did not try to name or interpret. Some things were not hers to read. "May I come in?" he asked. Seraphina looked at her son. She thought about what kind of man she wanted Aiden to become and what kind of example she intended to set for him in every decision she made from this day forward. She thought about the difference between rebuilding something and pretending it had not broken, and the fact that those were genuinely different things that could both be true simultaneously without contradiction. "Sit down," she said. "I will make tea. For the first 10 minutes, you will listen rather than speak. After that, we will figure out what comes next, one step at a time, and honestly." Selim came into the room. He sat down. Aiden walked directly across the floor to him, placed both small hands flat on Selim's knee, and looked up at him with dark, serious, assessing eyes. The same dark eyes that had found Seraphina's face in the very first seconds of his life and made her feel something she still did not have an adequate name for. Selim looked down at him. Something moved through his face that was beyond what Seraphina had words for, and she chose not to try. She turned to the small stove in the corner and began making tea. She listened to the quiet behind her, 2 people in the same space for the first time, deciding without words and without hurrying what they were going to be to each other. Both of them, she could sense, settling slowly and with some difficulty towards something like curiosity. Like the possibility of beginning. She did not let herself feel too much about it. She filed it carefully in the part of her that kept the things that mattered most and needed watching, and she continued doing what she had always done, holding the most important things together with precision and care in both hands, without ceremony and without requiring anyone to acknowledge that she was doing it. The difference now was that everyone knew. The entire 5 territories, the Elder Council, every witness in that great hall, they all knew who had been holding things together all along. And the Ashen Wilds, which were blank space on most official maps, were blank space no longer. The pact that bore their name was recognized in every territory in the 5 regions, its sovereign's authority written into elder law that would be cited and studied and referenced for the next 200 years. And the throne Seraphina returned to, built of plain timber by the hands of people who had found their way to her from the broken edges of everything they had lost and chosen, with full knowledge and full will, to build something new, was the most solid thing she had ever stood on. She had built it herself. With every piece of knowledge she had ever acquired, every relationship she had ever built, Every problem she had ever solved and every name she had ever remembered and every late night she had ever spent making something work that nobody would notice because it worked so well. And the world had learned, in a great hall where a king had knelt on cold stone before the woman he had discarded, that you do not throw away the person who builds things and call it your decision. Not when she has been paying attention every single day. Not when she has been building, quietly and without your permission, something that does not require your recognition in order to stand. Not when she was always, in every room she ever entered, the most important person in it. She had simply been the only one who knew. She thought about how she would explain all of this to Aiden one day. Not the betrayal, that was the least interesting part, when she thought about it from a certain distance. People made decisions out of selfishness and cowardice and confusion and called those decisions by better-sounding names, and that had been true for as long as there had been people to make decisions. The betrayal was the ordinary part. What was interesting, what was worth explaining, was what came after. The choice that presented itself in the aftermath and the decision she made about it. She could have been destroyed by it. People were. She had known people who had been hit by something similar and had spent the rest of their lives orbiting the wound, defining themselves by it, letting the damage become the most important fact about them. She understood the pull of that. It was real and it was not weakness, it was simply one of the available responses to being genuinely hurt, and she did not judge anyone who ended up there. But it had never been a real option for her. Not because she was exceptional or especially strong, she did not think of herself in those terms. It was simpler than that. She had a child coming, and a set of skills that could be genuinely useful to people who needed them, and a clear understanding of what was wrong and what could be done about it. Those three facts had pointed in a direction that was not toward collapse. She had followed the direction. That was all it was. She had followed the direction that was available to her, as clearly and as consistently as she could, one day at a time. And this was where following that direction had brought her. She thought she would tell Aiden that, when the time came. That the most important decisions you will ever make will not feel like monumental choices in the moment you make them. They will feel like the only thing available. The only direction that makes sense given what you know and what you care about and what you are capable of. The extraordinary is usually built from an accumulation of ordinary decisions made by people who simply kept going in the right direction when the alternatives were less right. She intended to raise him to understand that. Among other things. Now everyone did.